Yo, what's up, guys? Alex Baker here for Awesemo.com, talking some NFL Showdown, and joined today by Kyle Dvorchak. Kyle, how you doing, man?
Not bad. I think we were talking before the show. The last time we were on Los Angeles, San Francisco, and I think we both like some George Kittle in that spot. We had some 49ers, so hopefully we can create some more magic on what should be another maybe a game that's best played with some DFS as opposed to without.
Yeah, I mean, you can't get too stoked about tonight's matchup between the 1-4-1 Philadelphia Eagles and 1-5 Giants. Somehow between those two, the Eagles are a 5-point favorite, but we're really chasing the DFS prizes more than the outcome of the game, probably. We are sponsored by No House Advantage tonight, and thanks everyone for joining us. I'm sure there's other really entertaining options for you tonight. Maybe this game will be a little bit less controversial, so it should be fun. But let's take a quick look back before we dive into this game. What did we see on the last Showdown slate between 49ers and Rams?
Yeah, so that was one where I think George Kittle bucked the trend, which he tends to do, and tight ends not being particularly profitable at captain, but like he's George freaking Kittle. And it's like the second or third time he's done this too. So I think more of like tight ends not being optimal captain plays is that there aren't a ton of tight ends with target shares that equal wide receivers. That's just the numbers. But when you do have those players on the slate, I don't know if you could really argue we do have that tonight. Maybe you could say that about Evan Ingram. Maybe you could say that about old Richard Rodgers. But it's more about looking at the projections of those guys as opposed to saying X player of X position can't make it. And I think the same could be said for quarterbacks as well, where I'm not awfully high on quarterbacks all the time. But we have quarterbacks, specifically on DraftKings. I guess MVP is a different conversation on FanDuel. But we have quarterbacks tonight who've been running a lot, and that should absolutely change your calculus. So that was something that I think we can take away is just because a certain position is projecting a certain way or a certain position on the whole looks a certain way, there's definitely more to dive into with a guy like George Kittle, who's just a freaking god, and these Russian quarterbacks who can produce so much with their legs that they don't have to throw like 2 touchdowns to one guy who becomes the optimal captain.
Yeah, I mean, it's a nice choice for captain. I think it's wide open. I mean, you got a lot of great options between the quarterbacks, running backs, wide receivers. We'll get into it in a sec. First, the injury report for tonight. So I'm sure you guys all are aware Miles Sanders is out. We're expecting Boston Scott to be the main back in Philly. We got Zach Ertz out. Richard Rodgers is the replacement guy, but he hasn't really played much this year to date. And then for the Giants, we have Sterling Shepard back, and we have Deshaun Jackson back for the Eagles. So the only inactive that was significant was Quez Watkins. He played a little bit for the Eagles recently. So no need to change any lineups really. But before we dive deep, guys, if you could hit the like button, we'd appreciate that. It always helps us with our prognostication when we got a lot of positive feedback. And while you're at it, if you're not subscribed yet, make sure to hit that notification bell. We got a lot of great NFL content here. All of our NFL Showdown materials part of the Express membership on Awesemo.com. It's only $3.95 a week, so make sure to check that out. All right, so we got the Giants. Daniel Jones, man, he ran for like 75 yards and passed for like 100 something. So very uneven game the other day. And well, we have Sterling Shepard back tonight. But they really haven't been very effective on offense or defense, really. So what do you make of the Giants so far this season?
Yeah, they're bad. They're pretty bad. And the Daniel Jones saving grace has been that rushing production. And it's, I think, maybe different in some ways than Carson Wentz, who has done a lot of his damage on scrambles, whereas Daniel Jones actually had some design runs. Like he broke off a 49-yard run last week that was on a read option play. Then in the red zone, they gave him a kind of an interesting play where they spread the defense out wide with like a 4-wide set or something, or maybe it's like a tight end split out there. And then they just ran him up the middle from the 10-yard line, got him down to the 1 and kicked a freaking field goal. Imagine kicking a field goal there. But he is actually getting design runs, which is kind of the important thing I guess I need to get back to, is that he's gotten a lot of design runs and he hasn't, I don't believe, scored a touchdown in the year yet. So his rushing production might look a little skewed by yardage as opposed to touchdowns. But if he ends up scoring tonight, like he's a guy who, I said earlier that these Russian quarterbacks are really where you want to focus on if you want to play a quarterback at captain, because they have so much damage potential on their own that doesn't elevate a receiver. And it hasn't been great for anyone else because you said it was like under 200, might have been like under 150 passing yards in that game. Really did all this work as a runner. I don't think, actually, I know for a fact that they have no one to score a receiving touchdown outside of Darius Slayton, who has 3. So interesting to see how that has panned out. We've come in a lot of slates where we say a lot of guys could score touchdowns. Apparently, Darius Slayton is the only one who can score touchdowns for the Giants, at least through the air.
Yeah, I mean, they haven't really gotten much of a passing game going, sub 7 yards per attempt on the season. Philadelphia's pass defense isn't really a positive matchup either. But as you said, Daniel Jones, man, he got a ton of yards rushing the other night. And that always has a ton of upside for quarterbacks. The Showdown and single game plays page is free today, so make sure to check that out. I have him as about a 10% chance to be the highest scorer on DraftKings, 18% on FanDuel, so definitely one of the top 4 guys for captain tonight. And let's talk a little bit about this wide receiver situation because Sterling Shepard is back. So, I mean, when they signed Golden Tate, I mean, like it seems like there's no synergy between Sterling Shepard and Golden Tate because they're both like really small receivers, and it just seems like that doesn't mesh well. So I've never really loved that pairing in the backfield. I'm expecting Tate to take a little bit of a hit tonight because of Shepard being back. Shepard, maybe people are going to be hesitant to go back to him after he's out a few weeks. But what do you make of this wide receiver core for the Giants?
Yeah, I agree. They're 2 guys who would seemingly play very similar roles in just the low A dot like slot or like slot adjacent style players. So I do agree that there's probably of all receivers on the slate, a decent amount of like negative correlation between those 2. If you just look at how they're going to score points, both of them, and you could probably even lump Evan Ingram into this. They all need a lot of volume to score points. Like Evan Ingram, especially, you look at his A dot, it's incredibly low for tight ends, and he's still getting a lot of targets relative to tight end position. But all of them do need to kind of be peppered with targets or get a handful of looks in the red zone, like get 2 touchdowns or something to really have a blowout game. So I think that does give them a certain amount of upside capping effect on all of each other, those 3 specifically, but especially Tate and Shepard. And I do agree, Tate obviously takes a pretty solid hit as Shepard comes back in the lineup.
Yeah, so Tate has none of these guys are particularly exciting, and Slayton had a big game a couple of weeks ago, but last week wasn't that impressive. So I'm kind of like thinking maybe he'll be owned about where he should be, nothing crazy. But it's hard to really love any of the 3 guys. They do have a couple of sleeper receiver options on this team. We had Austin Mack replace Damian Ratley in the wide receiver core. He'll probably get a big hit to playing time because he played a lot of snaps last week, and now you bring Sterling Shepard back, that'll cut into it. But he's really, really cheap. And then you got Caden Smith. He's the second tight end. They do run a lot of 2 tight end sets in New York. And on average, they have 1.2 tight ends running routes per passing play. So Caden Smith is actually on the field a little bit more than you might expect, given that Evan Ingram is on the field almost every play. So what do you make of Caden Smith and Austin Mack as contrarian options?
Yeah, so I like Caden Smith, although I will say they can probably move to more 3 wide receiver sets now that they have Sterling Shepard back in, because I believe it was Golden Tate didn't play week 1. Sterling Shepard played less than a full game of week 2. And since then, they obviously haven't had their full loadout of receivers. I still think Caden Smith is in play because even like we saw last year, he got a little bit of run. So I think he's in play, but you do have to temper your expectations relative to what we've seen because they have a 3 receiver set on the table now, which they didn't necessarily have, or at least that wasn't preferred. I would imagine it wouldn't be preferred for them going down to like their 4th or 5th wide receiver on the depth chart. So a lower projection for him, but like at his price, like you just need a few catches or whatever. So.
Yeah, I mean, when you get these $200 guys, you really don't need a lot, but there are some good value options for kicker and special teams tonight, which we'll get into. So what about the running backs? So Devonta Freeman was signed after Saquon Barkley was injured for the year. He's seen his workload increase a little bit Last week, he got all but one of the rushing attempts. Dion Lewis is kind of their third down back, and then Wayne Gallman could be the odd man out, or maybe just getting some excess rushing attempts if New York runs the ball a ton. So what do you make of the Giants running backs?
Yeah, so I think we've seen up until last week, like you said, we saw a little bit of run from Wayne Gallman, but I do think Devonta Freeman, I think he's seen 77% or so of the running back carries in the previous 3 weeks. His first week with the team was a shortened week. He got 5 carries. So throwing that out because you can't really expect him to come in, he's gotten a ton of the work. Dion Lewis still gets some run as a pass catcher, which is, it's concerning, but you can't expect a guy getting 70% of he's not Chris McCaffrey, he's not Saquon Barkley. He's getting a lot of work relative to the expectations for him, especially as a runner. The only problem is if Vegas is right, which, they're pretty sharp there in Vegas, they're not going to have a ton of chances to actually give him the ball a ton, assuming they do take an early loss or an early deficit, that is. So maybe the game script doesn't set up for him well, but the market share numbers are at least quite impressive.
Yeah, I think, all right. So yeah, he actually has been pretty involved in the pass game over the last 3 weeks. About 45% of passing plays, he ran routes. So Freeman, he's pretty active in both phases of the game. So somewhat safe, but as you mentioned, not a matchup where we're really expecting Giants to just dominate by any means. So I'm kind of one thing you mentioned is the Giants kicked that field goal at the 1 yard line last week. And although that's tilting, we got to figure these coaching tendencies into our DFS lineups. And Graham Gano is the kicker for the Giants. If they're kicking in spots where other teams might run, maybe that means the kicker is a better play than usual. So what do you make of Graham Gano tonight?
Yeah, I don't hate Graham Gano. I actually think this is one of the slates more so than ones we talked about previously, that both kickers and defenses are coming into the fray a little bit more. I would say on the other side, Philadelphia, although I don't know, they made some questionable decisions, they do have generally a reputation as being one of the more aggressive, 4th down and 2-point conversion teams. So yeah, and on the opposite side, you're 1-win Giants and you're still kicking field goals at the one. So absolutely, I do think the tendency is not only skewed one way for the Eagles, but the exact opposite for Graham Gano and the Giants.
Yeah, so if you're just going off the team totals for these kickers, it might lead you the wrong direction. So make sure you're taking into account the coaching tendencies. I think that's a great read, and it matches up with the betting lines. I mean, I don't try to be an expert on kickers, so I refer to these lines a lot, and the Giants are projected for about 2 field goals in the implied odds, where the Eagles are closer to 1.5. So I mean, this is really getting into the weeds, but Graham Gano may be a good option. And we'll talk about the defense special teams in a bit because I certainly like them. But first, no house advantage. If you guys like betting props, and I think there's a lot of money in betting props because it's a relatively inefficient market. And you might as well bet against other people rather than betting against the sports books because you get limited and stuff. It's a lot easier to beat Joe Schmo, so no house advantage. You play DFS style contests, except you bet props. Plus, you can get a free $20 just for signing up with the promo code Awesemo. And never mind a free $20. So let's briefly touch on some props for tonight. We got these props on no house advantage and also on the sports books. What are some of the players you're looking to bet on tonight?
Yeah, so I think we're going to come on this almost every show and say that the half interception, especially on this slate with Daniel Jones and Carson Wentz, the half interception overs look quite nice. So since we say that every time, I'll throw out one extra one. Daniel Jones under 1.5 passing touchdowns. I think he's only hit that mark once this year, and he hit it less than half the time. It was 5 of 12 games, 12 starts at least in his rookie season. He just doesn't throw a ton of touchdowns. Probably because he's not very good. So the interceptions over for both. And passing touchdowns specifically, because they're both 1.5. If I'm taking one, I think Daniel Jones under 1.5 passing touchdowns is probably pretty equitable.
I like it. Yeah, I think that it goes back to what we're saying about the Giants are just kicking too many field goals. That just means less drives will end in touchdowns, unfortunately. So those props, the over on interceptions, under on Daniel Jones passing touchdowns. And I have all these in my projections page. But Travis Fulgham receptions, The line is 6.5. I mean, that would place him at like 80 yards. He's been really good, but I mean that's a really high bar. I just don't think that is quite warranted yet. So I do like Fulgham in DFS though. But one of the ones I bet in the prop markets is I saw this line, Richard Rodgers over under 30.5. And it's like the dude has barely played this year, right? In tight end, it's not usually positioned where the backups like really step in and fill the role of the Zach Ertz or Dallas Goedert. So I'm banking on the fact that maybe he gets held to fewer than 3 catches. I think that's a good bet. Are there any on the sports books you're looking at?
Yeah, I have one. I have to pop over to OddsShopper to make sure this is the best line. But looking at the line right now for Boston Scott, it's 49.5 rushing yards. Running back, on the other hand, is typically a position where a player can kind of just come in and assume the role of another player. And although Miles Sanders hasn't been great by any means, he's kind of coasted off of 2 like 70-plus yard runs. I just think the volume you can reasonably check for Boston Scott as a favorite on this Eagles team is enough to likely, I'm not banking on it, but he's likely to get over that 49.5 line. But I have to check on OddsShopper and make sure there aren't any other books that'd be better for it too. So go ahead and check OddsShopper out.
That's a good idea because obviously you want to bet the best odds. They'll give you more money when you win. So oddshopper.awesemo.com, or you can click it in our mini bar. All right, Eagles. So I think Travis Fulgham is the guy we gotta call out here because man, he's been on fire, and this is a guy that was on practice squads for the past year or two, and all of a sudden he's the leading receiver for the Eagles and like winning people a ton of money in DFS at low ownership the first week. We do have Deshaun Jackson back for the Eagles. No, I don't expect that to affect Travis Fulgham's role a ton because Deshaun Jackson, he's more of the deep threat. I'm expecting John Hightower to receive more of the hits to his workload. They do run pretty much like one-to-one rotations in Philadelphia in my experience. So what are you expecting Deshaun Jackson to be back to affect, and how does that affect Fulgham tonight?
Yeah, Fulgham does rack up a lot of air yards, but that's mostly because he has a reasonable non-Greg Ward ADOT on a lot of targets. Where on the other side, John Hightower actually in the past 3 weeks had slightly more air yards, just well over 300 in the past 3 weeks. Wasn't really converting on a ton of them, and I do think Deshaun Jackson's probably better than that. So I do think we see Deshaun Jackson play the true specific downfield role, and their offense still continues to run through Travis Fulgham. Greg Ward, a lot of kind of ugly work in the slot, or at least a decent amount of ugly work in the slot, just because he doesn't have a ton of upside on a per target basis. His ADOT's so low, and he's not even that good anyways. So yeah, I think Fulgham's role, maybe just because you have a more talented player opposite him, gets a small nick from Deshaun Jackson, but his snaps I don't think would take really any significant hit at all because like you said, Deshaun Jackson probably just comes in and completely sends John Hightower to the bench.
Nice. So that's got to make you feel pretty good about Fulgham. I mean, the volume has been there. He's been targeted on 25% of his routes, and it's equaled huge fantasy points as well. So really nothing to love except the fact that he's probably the hottest streak of any player on the slate, and that will drive the ownership up a lot. I do think he's a great play at captain as well. And on my single games plays page, you can get this information for free. I have him as a 12.9% chance to be the top scoring player in Fulgham. So definitely a guy I'm considering a lot of captain. Boston Scott, I think he's probably the play of the slate because Miles Sanders is out. As you mentioned, the workload is going to be there for Boston Scott. And we saw this in week 1 and a couple weeks last year. But in week 1, Boston Scott, Philadelphia, they had that. I can't remember if that was the week of the draw, but it was an ugly game. Boston Scott only saw 9 rushing attempts. Corey Clement saw 6. So nothing too skewed one way or the other there. Boston Scott saw 47% routes. Corey Clement saw 29%. So it's not a huge difference, but Boston Scott was clearly the guy they favored in Philly. Expect that to be the case here tonight. So what are you making of Boston Scott and Corey Clement tonight?
Yeah, I would even say that game might be a difficult representation of how much work I think Boston Scott will get. Because you said last year, I think he capped off his regular season with like a 19 carry game last year. It was the Washington game where they sacked Carson Wentz like 8 times, if I have that number correct, and Washington won that football game pretty handily. They didn't have a ton of chances to run, and I do believe Boston Scott even left that game briefly with like a lower body injury or something. He came back. He wasn't like awfully hurt. I do think, though, like Corey Clement after that game, for the most part, just went back to being a special teams player, whereas Boston Scott actually mixes in somewhat on offense, not a ton with Miles Sanders. But that makes me think that if one of these guys is a special teams player and the other guy is a guy who they actually view as the backup to Miles Sanders, I've won a lot of that backup to Miles Sanders. So I think Scott, like you said, is probably the most intriguing play at running back on the slate tonight. And I think it may be skewed a little bit because of that Washington game, but I'm not sure how much we can actually learn from that game because it was a game script that is nothing like what Vegas projects tonight. Maybe if you play this game a different way, you say it will be. But if Vegas is right, we should see, I think, a lot of Boston Scott carries. And he's a pretty adept pass catcher, too. And Miles Sanders got a decent amount of targets. Carson Wentz missed him on a lot of those targets. But I think that's probably just more variance than anything that he missed him on a handful of targets. I think we're going to see a lot of work from Scott, and I like him a lot.
Yeah, it's hard to picture any game script where Boston Scott won't get the most snaps. Like, it's hard to picture like a Madison scenario for Scott. Even if they are behind, he'll probably still pick up points from PPR. So really consistent play. We got to talk about the salary on FanDuel because Boston Scott's 6,500. He's like the 15th most expensive player. And man, it just makes building a lineup on FanDuel so easy to just jam in the top plays tonight. So are you just locking him in, and how does it affect the rest of your lineups?
Yeah, I'm not playing a ton of like the biggest entries, like total entries wise tournaments. And I think that's probably an advantage tonight because I'm not sure. I'll throw this back to you. I'm playing a ton of Boston Scott, but it's because I don't think like in a field of a few thousand, even if you're playing like a field of 100 or 200 people, whatever it happens to be, you don't need to get that unique. You're not focusing on building a massively unique lineup. Whereas like tonight, I know people have already talked about, and I don't agree, but I know people have already talked about like FanDuel being a solved format. Tonight is going to be difficult if you're playing in the largest field tournaments to move away from like by far the best, like just such a bad price. If you're playing in these largest tournaments, how do you approach that? Because I don't like intentionally on this slate, I'm not really going to be facing that problem of the best play. Everyone knows he's like, I would hope everyone knows he's the best play. So how do you approach that? Because I don't have the answer. And luckily I'm not playing in the largest field tournament, so I don't need the answer, but it's difficult.
Well, I think what you were saying about playing for the tournament structure you're in is huge. So this biggest tournament on FanDuel today has 130,000 entries. And the thing about Boston Scott being so cheap, it reduces the number of good lineups by a lot. Because usually the salary cap kind of evens out all the players. When you have a really cheap, like lock player, it just makes everyone have the same lineups. So I think I'm just... I don't know if I'm getting more different than like I would normally would. I'm just trying to avoid like the most optimized lineups in this particular tournament and just try to like be at least like a few plays off of something that just like clicks perfectly, because it's going to be really easy to build a lineup on FanDuel tonight that you just fall in love with. The only problem is everyone else is going to have it too.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think FanDuel single games is still profitable if you utilize the right strategies. Make sure to check out all the tools on our site to help you do that. It's just you got to really understand the format. It's a lot more about game theory than figuring out the best lineups, I would say. So if you like the game of trying to figure out like who everyone else is going to pick, FanDuel I think isn't bad. But yeah, I understand a lot of the frustration with the FanDuel format because it's like you can only make a certain number of lineups that are ending good on FanDuel. Like, and tonight it's even exaggerated because Boston Scott is so cheap. So I'll have a lot of Scott. I'll just try to mix it up elsewhere. But man, yeah. All right, so now Deshaun Jackson being back, it's so hard to like read what's going to happen after injury. Like this season, we've seen like the whole gamut where a guy could come back like more than healthy, like Julio Jones, and just completely just, like nuke a slate. On the other side, you see guys like Brandon Cooks week 1 who like he was questionable all week and they played like 45% of the snaps. So where do you expect Deshaun Jackson to fall? I mean, he has a long injury history, so.
Yeah, he has this just truly like bitter injury history. I think it's been 5 or more years since he played a full 16-game season. He logged like 1 15-game season there. We saw him come in, ball out in one game last year, and immediately, I think it was like a core injury or something. Same thing essentially happens after 2 or 3 games. Didn't ball out, but I consider balling out getting a lot of air yards because, I just feed my family with these air yards because, I joke about liking air yards a lot. They're one of the things we should be targeting. And he got a lot of air yards. I think it was either through 2 weeks or 3 weeks. It's probably through 2 weeks. He was second in the NFL in air yards because I remember it was the air yards champions. Him and AJ Green were facing off. He was getting a lot of work in that deep burner role. And I'm not sure, they could play John Hightower in the mix with him. But I do think because we saw him play such a voluminous role in the first 2 or 3 weeks, we see a lot of that role come back. I don't think we see maybe all of it come back. It would be understandable for them to ease him back in. But, what are they going to do? Run 2 tight end sets with Jason Kroom? Their options are so limited that I don't know if they have much of a choice.
Well, yeah. I mean, the thing about Deshaun Jackson is I feel like he's never been a guy that goes out and plays every snap either. Just like you said about not playing every game. When he was in Tampa, I mean, he had great seasons, but he'd only be out there about 2/3 of the snaps. And given the injury history, I think that's probably the most I'd expect tonight. But he's still so exceptional at efficiency that could equal a big performance. Although we have very small sample of recent games to go off of because he only played 1 game last year. That was crazy. One guy that's a little bit less exciting but so good, I think Greg Ward, you're mentioning how ridiculously low his ADOT is, and that makes him not exciting for those big plays, but he does rack up a lot of receptions, although Fulgham has been the biggest target recently. So do you see Greg Ward as being a valuable piece tonight?
Yeah, I'm not making him a core part of my strategy, and I rag on him a lot for not getting a ton of downfield targets. But yeah, especially without Zach Ertz, who was kind of playing a very similar role to Greg Ward in the sense of he was just this middle of the field relief option. No Zach Ertz, who was incredibly inefficient anyways. Greg Ward could actually be a contributor in picking up those targets because unless you expect Richard Rodgers to come in and get 7-8 targets, the offense gets a lot worse, which Zach Ertz wasn't even good. So I don't think the offense actually gets that much worse without him. I think those targets just get distributed. It's been Fulgham as of late, but now without Zach Ertz, I do think you can definitely play Greg Ward. I rag on him a lot, but he's certainly in play because of simple target volume. And he falls into that same range of we talk about it with Sterling Shepard, we talk about with Golden Tate, but he's on the offense that's projected to do better tonight. So I do think he at least has probably more touchdown equity than those guys as well.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, not an exciting player, but the volume's decent. He would be a guy that maybe I think he's pretty cheap on tonight's slate, so I can't even say he'll be really contrarian at 4,800, but solid nonetheless. He did have a 20-point game this season already. That's not bad. What about the rest of the guys? Do you see any deep sleepers here? I saw someone asking about John Hightower. We got Arcega Whiteside, or maybe do you have any love for the Eagles tight ends? Zach Ertz is out. They got 3 active: Jason Kroom, Hakeem Butler, and Richard Rodgers.
Yeah, out of the backup tight ends, I think they picked up Hakeem Butler off of Carolina's practice squad because he wasn't good enough to cut it on the Cardinals practice squad. So I guess I would go with Jason Kroom, who got 1 snap last week, or maybe it was 1 or 2 snaps last week. He would be the backup tight end, and I don't know, they run 2 tight end sets a lot, mostly because they had 2 good tight ends, but maybe they stick with that as well. I don't hate John Hightower because if he does end up playing even just a third of him and Deshaun Jackson essentially split that out wide deep burner role, just playing a third of that role could be enough to get him there because it's not going to take that awfully much. So I think he's simply just a flyer, but I do think he'll be a way to get different because Travis Fulgham is so hot. He'll be popular. I do think people recognize Deshaun Jackson's name and go oh, you play him in a GPP. I think he's just that guy. I do think John Hightower, even if he's just getting a third of those Deshaun Jackson snaps, could pop off. not going crazy with him, but I do think he's probably one of the flyers worth considering. In terms of like, if we're talking about flyers on the Eagles, I don't hate Corey Clement either, but it's just a bunch of like mixing these guys in.
Yeah, I agree. I think that Hightower, probably one of the more likely like non-starters to go off tonight. So like I kind of like the no name recognition, but also he's been like playing, and I'm worried that people might not realize that with Deshaun Jackson back, he won't be playing as much. So I'm kind of torn. But yeah, you got some options on this Eagles team. Guys, we got some tough competition on this channel to get the likes with likes of Josh Engelman. But we like the bragging rights. If you could please smash the like and hit that subscribe button and the notification bell. Appreciate all that stuff. Also, we got a special deal going on with the Champions League right now. So I know we got football 3 nights a week, and you got football a lot of days of the week. So you can use the promo code Champions League for $2 soccer projections. So that's fun. We got a really great guy, Giovanni Vidal, who creates a lot of great content and projections. So that's been really cool. All right, so let's talk about some lineups here. I know like people like to tell a story in their lineups, and the game script is kind of how we'd be figuring it out. So I kind of came up with 4 game scripts that are most likely like either team passing or either team rushing. So let's start off with Philadelphia passing being kind of like the top scoring option tonight. Who would be your top options to build a lineup around that?
Yeah, in that case, for me, it's pretty clearly Travis Fulgham. I still think you could probably work some Carson Wentz in there, but Travis Fulgham, just the amount of targets he's getting has been incredible in the past 2 weeks. He's gaining a decent amount of air yards in those targets, too, because he's not simply just like a dump-off guy. He moves the chain. So Travis Fulgham would be that guy for me pretty clearly.
Yeah, definitely. I think Fulgham's solid. I do have a lot of love for Greg Ward, just because I feel like he's not the sexy play. I have some lineups with him at captain. I'm just hoping, he gets the touchdown, he gets the PPR points, and we don't have a huge sample to say that Fulgham is going to get way more targets than Greg Ward. Greg Ward historically has been targeted a decent amount. He was targeted on 21% of routes last year and 18% this year. Fulgham is at 25% this year. So that's been really high. Don't expect that to necessarily stay that high. So I think Greg Ward could be a sneaky captain pick for the Philly passing lineup. Let's talk about the Philly rushing. So obviously Boston Scott's your main guy. How would that affect the rest of your lineup?
So I think they're probably maybe too expensive for it to work in like a normal lineup, but I do think double running back. We actually saw it happen twice recently. Clyde Edwards-Helaire, Darrell Williams. And I think it was a few weeks ago, it was probably Alvin Kamara, Latavius Murray might have been it. We saw Alexander Madison as a backup get in and be like a great play in that slate. And they ran so much that I think if Dalvin Cook had a better game before he got hurt, like they ran like 40 times that game. So double running back is something I think people like who are especially hand building lineups, but people might even set rules to avoid double running back. I think it's probably something in how unique it gets you. You should maybe be targeting more of in your lineups. I think especially on this slate, if you go into it believing that Philly does end up having a pretty solid lead, I wouldn't shy away from that. We can just see them have such a positive game script. That's what they choose. Eagles defense at captain. We talked about having defense at captain. I don't remember if it was last slate or if it was one of the other ones we had, but defense at captain or just defense in general has kind of gotten wrecked this year because of the crazy amount of scoring. But this slate doesn't look to be like that average slate where we see a ton of scoring. I've been skeptical of defense at captain in the past, but I do think the ownership every week it doesn't hit is just going to continue coming down. And if there were ever a week like Daniel Jones at quarterback as an underdog to an Eagles team that not a bad defense by any means, I don't actually hate that. And it doesn't take a lot to get over the field. And that would probably also correlate with Boston Scott. Like they would probably be pretty big favorites if the defense does end up having a captain worthy game.
Definitely. I love the defense this night. You got both quarterbacks throwing a decent amount of picks. The over-under is low, and they're just really, really cheap. I think it's pretty likely that if a a lot of players have decent games, but no one player like has a huge game. Defense captain could sneak in even if they don't put up a huge score, just based on the pricing. So that's definitely an angle I'm taking tonight. I agree with if you pick Miles Sanders at captain, I kind of almost like putting Clement in your lineup at flex, because the thing about Miles Sanders is he's like 5'7". He's not the kind of guy that's going to go out and run the ball 20 times. So if the Eagles run the ball 40 times, I mean, maybe that's maybe like 35 times, like Clement could rack up a way bigger role than you might expect. I find a lot of times people don't really factor in that the workload split varies so much on how many touches each guy gets. And I think that's going to be something that will affect the ownership on the Giants running backs too, because Devonta Freeman, he got 18 touches last week. The other running backs got 0 rushing attempts. But then the previous week when the Giants ran 24 rushing plays, he got 18. So it didn't change. So that's definitely something I'm considering tonight. Let's talk about Giants passing. Who would be in your lineup if you're trying to target that?
Yeah, so I think Darius Slayton is the obvious choice. I do think you go with Daniel Jones as well, though. I think of the quarterbacks, he'd probably be my preferred one to play in captain, because I think his rushing upside is probably much more so than Carson Wentz. Wentz hasn't been a dud as a rusher by any means, but like I said earlier, I do think a decent amount of that would have come on like scramble specifically, where it's just like it's kind of a net negative for the team because that means they're getting so much pressure. Daniel Jones actually just been getting design runs, so I think him and Darius Slayton make a lot of sense. I don't mind going to the other players. Like if they make my captain when I'm building 150, it is what it is. I wouldn't really be targeting them though. Like, do you think you could definitely get an ownership edge by just playing like Sterling Shepard and the captain? There's just so much that has to break right for him to be there, because he needs a lot of targets to get there or multiple touchdowns. So I'm not like too keen on that, but I definitely think the ownership game does point to potentially Tate or Shepard. Just like if no one's going to play them, they're going to be on the field a lot. Anything can happen in an NFL game. I don't hate it. What do you think about those guys?
Yeah, I think anytime you're playing on DraftKings, the wide receiver at captain makes a lot of sense, because wide receiver has the highest variance of any position. It's one game, so really that just makes him have a little bit higher chance of being the highest scorer. But I like Sterling Shepard a lot on my Showdown play tool. I have him at 3.8% chance of being the highest scorer, and the ownership at captain is lower than that. So I think there's an edge there. Golden Tate, I'm not as keen on, just because I'm worried that Sterling Shepard is going to eat into his role a little bit. And then Slayton, he's like the obvious number one receiver. Not quite as big a gap as some other teams, but solid nonetheless. I'm not super crazy about him tonight, just because the ownership at captain looks like it could be there. But I think, I like the idea of either putting Daniel Jones or Sterling Shepard at captain, and then the other one at flex. Let's talk about the Giants rushing, because Devonta Freeman's obvious, but it's hard to really find any Wayne Gallman or Dion Lewis, or are you going to get to them?
I'll get to them a little bit, but there's not a ton of love on my end from these guys. I think maybe another scenario, it's even less likely as we talk about things that are unlikely to happen, but would make you a lot of money if they did. Giants defense captain could also work out as well. I believe they're still top half in the NFL in sacks, and Carson Wentz has taken the most sacks of any quarterback in the NFL this year on a per game basis. They're number 32. They give up a lot of pressure. I know their offensive line, I think, got maybe Lane Johnson back or someone tonight, but they've been pretty much have no continuity on their offensive line. They've still lost a lot of guys. And also taking sacks is something that can still be inherent in the way a quarterback plays. I know pressure rates are actually pretty sticky for a quarterback specifically, offensive line or not. So another one, very low probability. We're talking about the running game because having your defense go off would help the running game. Another one, I don't know how you feel. I think Giants' defense of all slates, facing Carson Wentz has been pretty good this year. And it's ugly, but I don't hate it.
No, I like the Giants to see a captain a lot. I think that a lot of people may avoid it because the thing is when you I'd say about maybe 25-30% of lineups in these slates are made by Optimizer. I mean, I use Fantasy Cruncher obviously, but you gotta make some tweaks to get the defense to appear at captain, because as far as projection, they're not usually going to pop in there. Tonight might be an exception because how cheap they are. But defenses score touchdowns. I mean, not at a super high rate. I have each of them projected to score about 1/5 of a touchdown. So the odds aren't great. But when they do, you're usually getting 7, 8, or 9 points, because you also get points for like the interception, the sack, the fumble. So those plays, if you get a couple fluke plays, that really, really adds up. So that's definitely something I'm considering tonight. Are there any other game scripts that you might go for in your lineups?
I think maybe the only other game script is both these teams suck, which they kind of do, which I think would just be another one. You kind of touched on it earlier, so I won't bag on it too much, where if all the players do fine enough, like this is like, 17-14 or whatever, that's another scenario in which defense would make some sense of captain because they're cheap. They could still have a good game. They don't even necessarily need a touchdown in that scenario if everyone is just fine. So if both of these teams, if it's neither running or passing, just these teams can't get much going, just a few Greg Ward targets puts him in the optimal lineup, 1 touchdown from Boston Scott. That's another scenario where I think defense makes a decent amount of sense as well.
Yeah, I think that this game more than others has that potential for sure. I mean, I don't think any of us would be real surprised if this game is a stinker, and if it is, I think stacking the defense, and then I guess maybe you take the quarterbacks because they kind of rack up points just from passing the ball. Maybe go for some PPR. It's a little bit tough to fill the rest of your lineup, I'd say, when you pick 2 defenses, but I think it is a solid build nonetheless. Let's talk about favorite captains. I mean, we got the top Showdown plays tool free today, so we can work in those percentages. But who's really standing out to you at captain?
Yeah, I like a lot of Boston Scott at captain, both because he's kind of game script proof, but if he does end up scoring touchdowns like we talk about on the show, you do end up he doesn't help anyone else on his team. Quarterbacks on this slate more so than others. Maybe it's just my own personal adjustment as I'm low on quarterbacks on normal slates. These quarterbacks I actually like a decent amount. So quarterbacks, Boston Scott. Don't mind Fulgham. I do think the field is probably fairly right on him. I maybe a little bit of edge in playing Travis Fulgham, but I'm starting to get on this Greg Ward bandwagon with you.
Nice. Yeah, I think when you look at the two, so Fulgham has averaged 22.5 fantasy points per game. I just feel like that number is going to stick out like a sore thumb. People are going to gravitate towards that. And it stinks for us because he's a really good play tonight. He's just going to be on everyone's rosters. Greg Ward, on the other hand, 9.4 fantasy points per game. Definitely not really having a great year so far. So I mean, they both fit in different builds because one's contrarian and one's kind of the good chalk. But as far as overall feeling, I mean, I have more Fulgham, but I kind of like Greg Ward as being a money maker in lineups too. So on the ones that I'm finding more than normal, we've been talking about all night, the defenses, both Giants and Eagles. There's supposed to be a lot of sacks in this game. And I agree with what you were saying earlier about how defense hasn't produced this year to the level we've been used to. And I don't think many people who are casual players are going to click that because it's the least sexy option. And then you also when you optimize, you don't get a ton of defense at captain either. So it's kind of I feel like people might be missing out, but I'll be there. But then just anyone who's a receiver as well, makes some sense. So as Sterling Shepard, you could do Evan Ingram. I'm just kind of spreading out some love there. What about on FanDuel?
Yeah, on FanDuel, the Boston Scott thing. I mean, I'm playing all of my FanDuel action right now is in fairly low stakes and low entry specifically. I don't have to get weird because I'm playing in low entry. So it's a ton of Boston Scott. And then you move on to the quarterbacks. I don't like Devonta Freeman maybe has a little bit of extra equity on FanDuel. I just think the Boston Scott price is so bad that it's hard to get off of. And I kind of agree, especially for me, I'm just building in leverage different ways as opposed to trying to get off of the best play. And because I'm playing in lower entry tournaments, I don't need too hard to get off of the best plays. If you are playing in those big tournaments, potentially if you want to not just lock button Boston Scott, I do think maybe Devonta Freeman makes some sense outside of the quarterbacks, obviously.
That's true. I mean, they got a decent negative correlation because when Freeman runs the ball a lot, you don't expect Philadelphia to have a tremendous number of running plays. So that makes sense. Man, it's so hard to get away from Boston Scott on FanDuel, though, at 6,500. I like what I'm seeing in my lineups tonight is I just left a ton of salary on the board. Like this one I'm looking at here, 13.5 thousand left on the board. I mean, that sounds like a ridiculous amount. Obviously, this is only in their biggest prize pool tournament, but I'm going for 200K. I don't want to split first with 5,000 people and win $300, which is a very distinct possibility if you spend all your salary today. So that's my move, is just not spending all the salary. Do you think, man, I mean, obviously the quarterbacks on FanDuel, I saw I had a kicker and a captain in one lineup. I'm like, should I just swap that out? Because that seems absurd, but it's like there's 130,000 people in this tournament. So would you ever consider that?
Yeah, in the largest tournament, I do think, this one maybe ends up just being like good. If like Boston Scott goes out and gets hurt, like people who are just building for unique lineups are going to print so much money and be so incessant on Twitter that like a kicker kind of functions the same way, where the odds of it hitting are so low. But on this slate where Boston Scott is going to be the MVP of so many lineups, yeah, I think it's possible. I do think though that maybe because so many people are gravitating to Boston Scott, you don't have to get that weird. But I'm not entirely sure on that. I don't hate kicker there. I'm not in love with it. I probably wouldn't be doing it much, but in a tournament where like one of your biggest goals should be to not chop if you do take down first, I don't hate that.
Yeah, I might be exaggerating my love for the kicker, but I do have him on FanDuel in a couple of lineups. But Marcus says, is Richard Rodgers an optimal captain on FanDuel? So Kyle, I'll let you take a stab at this one. Richard Rodgers, captain on FanDuel.
Optimal. I don't like maybe optimal is in like no one's going to play him there. But I think that's probably for good reason. I think we're just saying like mathematically the best projection play. No, it's Boston Scott.
Yeah, I think Rodgers, he hasn't put up like any like receiving performances like of note like for years. You know, he has, let's see, he's been in Philadelphia since 2018. He has 108 yards total. But a lot of them have been this year. He had 31 in the previous game, 35 in week 4. So sneakily, he's been kind of racking up the production. It's just I don't feel really confident about that. I mean, he did play 43% of snaps last week. It's not bad. So I think he does have an outside chance of being the top scoring player. You'd have to find the end zone a couple times. All right, guys, if you have any questions, make sure to drop them in chat here. Anthony says, will Boston Scott score more than Wentz tonight?
No, in a medium projection, no, probably not, but it's possible, right?
Yeah. It's kind of like it's not really something I try to call is like who's going to score more than who. Is just like what percentage of the time is the guy going to score a lot. Yeah. So that's why I really like this top Showdown plays tool. So I do have Carson Wentz as being a 25% chance to be the top scoring player on DraftKings, and Boston Scott 12%. Carson Wentz has been running a lot, and that helps a lot. It's also that there are a lot of receiving options with Deshaun Jackson coming back. So I could see him spreading out the production to a few different guys and getting the number one himself. So that's the way I'm leaning there. Is Ingram being overlooked, says James.
We haven't talked about him a lot. I don't love him because he essentially just fills this same role as Sterling Shepard or Golden Tate, where he gets a lot of targets. Like he's like fancy Greg Ward, or Greg Ward is fancy Evan Ingram. So I just think with a guy like him, I'll just play the ownership games, and if like he's going to be fairly popular, which we have him right now as. Right now, he is captained owned at 4%. Our top stacks tool says that maybe don't buy that as much. And in the flex, kind of the same story, where he's not like a downright awful play. I just think the odds of him really having a great game because of the way he's used seem fairly unlikely.
Yeah, he's been a little bit disappointing because he was such a prospect and he hasn't gotten there yet. It doesn't seem like a great option, but it all comes down to the ownership. All right, Chris says thoughts on Jalen Hurts tonight.
I like him. I thought he was a pretty sick prospect coming out of college. Do I think we see him for more than like 2 less than useful Taysom Hill plays? Like probably not.
Yeah, so I do see the backup quarterbacks being owned a little bit too much in DFS. You'll see like 1% ownership. They do get there once in a while. We saw Matt Moore in Kansas City be in the optimal last year, and that was a big payday for someone. So it's not crazy, but Carson Wentz, I thought if he was going to get benched, it would have come last week where he had 3 yards at the half. So if that didn't do it, then like pretty unlikely unless there's an injury. A. Dean says, why would Scott be a popular MVP?
Why would Scott on FanDuel be the popular MVP? What do we say, 6.5K? That'd be why.
Yeah, well, they don't have the multiplier there for MVP, so I'm kind of thinking like maybe people like are a little hesitant to scroll that far down before they pick their MVP. So
maybe
we'll see how it turns out, but really solid play at MVP. Phil says thoughts on Kroom. I'm kind of not sure if Kroom's going to play a ton or it's going to be Hakeem Butler or neither will play a ton. So what do you think of Kroom?
Yeah, I think he's more likely because he's been active to be the number 2 tight end, but not a ton of interest in him. I just don't see, if I'm not going to be excited about Richard Rodgers, I'm probably definitely not going to be excited about Kroom. I do have him projected to be the number 2 tight end as opposed to potentially Hakeem Butler, who is like a converted receiver who busted at receiver and couldn't even hang on like certain practice squads for a while. So I think Jason Kroom is likely to be the number 2. Does that mean more than 5 snaps? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, he'll have some plays. Not someone to get super excited about, but as a minimum price flyer, he's as good as any. I do think that Kroom will be overowned given that he's posted 7.3 fantasy points per game on average. This was just one catch though. So I think like people are going to look at the $200 options. They're going to see that number and click Kroom a lot. And I think for that reason, I don't think he's my favorite. Nicholas says, Alex, this one's your favorite on FanDuel. I know he's your top Showdown. So FanDuel tonight, it's all about the tournament I'm playing. I mean, it's so easy to dupe the lineups tonight that I kind of like going off the board a little bit more captain, even though it's not as good a percentage play. I also left a ton of money on the table in a lot of lineups. I kind of like my Boston Scott captain because I feel like they might not scroll down that far. Kyle, how do you feel about Wentz at captain on FanDuel?
Yeah, I think, the quarterbacks and Boston Scott are really where I'm focusing on. What did you say? You dropped the number earlier on the number of people that are MMEing in these slates. And I do think there is like a distinct difference between someone MMEing actually getting a lot of Boston Scott and someone who like the physical act of scrolling down might actually be a barrier to not playing him.
It makes a difference. And especially on FanDuel where you pick your MVP first, you don't have to pay more for them. So it almost feels bad to pay down at captain. Mr. Barnes says thoughts on Clement. I think Clement is solid. I think that he'll pick up all the excess workload if Philadelphia has a lot of rushing attempts. So what do you make of Clement?
Yeah, that's how the same way I feel about him is he's probably just a number 2 or maybe a little bit more than your average number 2 back. But honestly, I mean, he's kind of pricey for what I thought he would be. He should be cheaper probably, but I don't think he'll be highly owned. We've seen backup running backs hit in recent weeks, and I don't think that's awfully surprising because, like you said, the market share numbers on a week-to-week basis for any backfield are still fairly in flux. Like Devonta Freeman gets all of the 18 carries and then gets 18 of what you said was like 25 or something. The same thing could happen here, and we even have less reasons to be certain about what these market share numbers should be because we have almost no sample of it. So I don't hate Clement. Not going crazy on him. Don't know if I'll have like any of them in captain, but I do think he's a pretty solid flex play.
Yeah, I like Clement as a sleeper. J Love, thanks for the super chat. He says Freeman or Shepard as a last spot flex.
I think I would take Sterling Shepard there, especially in the flex, because we talk about a lot as the captain running backs make a lot of sense because they give you some sort of uniqueness in terms of the points they actually score don't get shared. I'll go with Shepard there, although it kind of depends on what the rest of your lineup is.
Yeah, I think that Shepard I feel a little bit less confident in because he's coming off the injury. And then as far as projection, I have them about the same. So I guess it depends a lot on the rest of your lineups. Who's in the rest of your lineups? What game script you're trying to play for. All right. So Trump or Biden for cash? I didn't enter any of those on any of those pools, unfortunately. Does that start at 8? Maybe there's some time to get in some pools if you're into the free contests. Ronnie says Alex gonna lose that Thunderdome. Hey, we still got 3 days left, man. And why are you hating? All right. Rodney says Shepard limited snaps. So that'd be concerning. Have you seen any reason to think that?
Yeah, I didn't see anything before we went on, although I try not to check my phone as much as when we're on. I can pull up news right now and make sure, although we'd be running out of time to get anything changed. But I didn't see anything about that like in the week leading up. And up until today, it was pretty known that he was going to play. So I think we would have sort of had an idea of his status. Not that he couldn't come out and play limited snaps, but I just don't think we have any like actual news to know for that reason. I'll check right now just on the off chance, but I don't think so.
I see this report from Jordan Renan. He's an ESPN guy. He says the hope is that he plays a limited number of snaps. That's definitely scary. So, yeah, there's still a couple minutes to swap off him, but I think not a terrible play nonetheless. But so wait, I'm trying to think how to best play this because that does seem concerning.
And I've sided with Renan at Roto World a few times. Like he's not just a Twitter rando. He's at least has some valuable information to go on.
Yeah, so I don't mind a last minute swap here off Sterling Shepard. In fact, I might throw that in here. I ended up getting him a lot. So let's see who the swaps are. Golden Tate is cheaper on DraftKings, so that makes a really easy swap. So I don't mind. You got 20 seconds left making that swap because if Sterling Shepard is limited, that means Golden Tate's role will be bigger than I was projecting. So let's see if I can get this in here. So it's always great when we get people helping us out in chat. So hopefully everyone was able to make a swap there. And then hopefully Shepard doesn't go out and destroy because that would be tilting. But Kyle, any final thoughts for tonight's slate now that we're locked?
Yeah, now that we're locked, well, shout out to chat for looking out for the boys because I try and mostly focus on the show while I'm here, so I can I upload unless there's any crazy breaking news. I upload my CSV before we come on, so shout out to chat. Thanks for that, and let's again hope for some defense.
Yeah, definitely. I think defense was a pretty sick play tonight, and hopefully we get some defensive touchdowns. Hopefully we get an exciting game and we see some big takedowns from you guys. So if you do end up taking down a tournament, make sure to let everyone know that it inspires everyone to keep chasing the dream. And thanks a lot to No House Advantage. If you haven't checked out their site yet, it's like DFS for props. It's really cool because you don't have to play against the house. So thank you guys all for supporting the channel, and good luck.